giving you the information you need. This is Inside the News. Here's Guy, Ben, and Frank.
Welcome back to our next segment of Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. Frank Vernuccio and Ben Brunson, both online. Frank Vernuccio, you can find him at usagovpolicy.com. Ben Brunson at benbrunson.com and amazon.com. Welcome back, guys. Hi, Ben.
Hello, Guy. Hello, Frank. Pleasure to be back.
Welcome back, Frank.
Happy Independence Day, gentlemen.
All right. On this 4th of July, there's been a new report issued on China's military strength. And, Frank, this is significant, isn't it?
It is. It's the Department of Defense's 2017 annual report to Congress on the military and security developments involving China. It's very similar to what used to be issued during the Reagan administration about the military strength of the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the findings are not something that will let you sleep all that well at night. The fact of the matter is, since about 1996, the Chinese have made extraordinary strides. They've captured the American lead in technology. And they did it on the cheap. You'll be rather aggravated to know that as American taxpayers, you essentially helped fund China's military rise. The fact is, through cyber theft, old-fashioned espionage, and outright purchase, the Chinese have gotten enough technology to move their armed forces to a status of being among the most technologically adept on the planet, equaling the United States, and actually in some areas, particularly in shore-to-ship missiles, their technology might actually exceed some of the stuff that we actually have. Now, during this time period, as the Chinese have risen to superpower status, the United States military has in many aspects deteriorated. We used to look at China basically as a very large force, but not a particularly modern one. Now the Chinese are doing exceedingly well and beating us in many ways, not only in numbers, but in modern sophistication as well. During the past couple of months, President Xi has unified the command of many of China's armed forces branches. They're all called the People's Liberation Army, in such a way that they are at a streamlined war-fighting status, very capable. One of the things that the report issued that's most interesting at all is the increase in China's ability for force projection. Now, you might assume that China is a great power, but perhaps only in the Pacific or in Asia. That's no longer correct. China now has the ability to project power pretty much across the globe, and that power is increasing exponentially each day. Something to be very careful about. One of the things also that we have to realize is that this occurred almost in the absence of any real threat to China. As the United States went through the difficult Obama years when we essentially drew down our military, China, rather than taking that as a sign that peace was at hand and they didn't need to invest so much money in their military, actually used it as a period of rebuilding their military and becoming even stronger in proportion to the United States and the rest of the world.
Okay, Ben, we know that the military of China is starting to grow, but there's been a new deal announced with Taiwan that China says you better not go there, huh, Ben?
Well, of course, we've talked about this on the show a number of times. The one China policy is the central driving foreign policy issue for the mainland of China. As far as the mainland of China is concerned, Taiwan is a wayward republic. It would be like Hawaii declaring its independence from the U.S. The Chinese will not give it up. They will reunify Taiwan at some point in the future. They've never been willing to go to war over it yet, but they have made it very clear that that is the one thing they would go to war with the United States over. So it's a very troubling issue. But I'd like to talk about China on a broader perspective. The U.S. Economy is about an $18 trillion economy right now. China's right around $11 trillion in size, so it's catching up rapidly with the United States. The per capita GDP in China is only about 20-25% of the U.S. per capita GDP. Of course, they have 4 times the population there, 1.3 billion Chinese. The reality of military strength, I'm an economist. You guys know that. I'm an economist by training. The reality of military strength is that It is a derivative of your economic power. So the bigger your economy, the bigger your military can be. And China, as a result, will become a superpower on par with the United States militarily. It is pretty much inevitable. I have real issues on China's ability to sustain its growth over time, and I do think there are elements that will lead the Chinese economy, just like Japan did about 25 years ago, to start to stagnate. But we'll leave that for another show. But the fact is that we have a new reality with a superpower. It is going to cause us to cede influence in Asia to China. I think it is a realistic foreign policy for us to adopt and to realize that we don't want to go to war with China over some of these things, like its expansion in the South China Sea. As deplorable as I think it is a reality we have to live with based on China's power. And so there's going to be a new reality. I think eventually the U.S. and China, if I look down the road 20, 30, 40 years, will be natural allies in a very different strategic scenario that we will face at the time. And that is the rise of Islamic influence on a global basis, and what happens in Europe over the next 2 or 3 generations.
Okay, having said that, Ben, now, Frank, what should we take away from China's influence into North Korea? Because North Korea is still that pariah that still is a danger.
Well, Guy, that's absolutely right. And, of course, the troubling point in all this is that China continues to benefit from North Korea's belligerence in its weapons program. It diverts American attention away from China's military rise. And, of course, if North Korea did decide to do something particularly harmful to American, South Korean, or Japanese forces in the region, the power that benefits from that belligerence would be none other than China itself. The hope that China would actually intervene to limit North Korea's nuclear program is one that seems to be not very strong at this point. It just doesn't seem that China has any interest in doing it. They will talk a good game, and indeed they have talked a good game, but when it comes down to doing anything at all, they seem reluctant to do something that is, after all, against their interest. North Korea and its military power focuses American, Japanese, and South Korean military might on North Korea rather than on China. I thought it was particularly telling when China reacted so sharply to the American emplacement of its anti-missile system in South Korea, with North Korea continuing to rattle its nuclear saber. The American step to put anti-missile defenses in South Korea was a logical, indeed almost an inevitable step, and yet China reacted as though it was pointed directly at them. I think it tells you a lot about what China's perspective is and what their intentions are, at least in the near future.
You know, Ben, we might consider ourselves, and we very well might be the greatest nation on the planet, but yet we are kind of on the outside because China's got more cards in the deck that are playable than we do, don't we? Or don't they?
Well, certainly in Asia, in their limited sphere of influence, that is true. It is still the United States that is the beacon of freedom around the world. This will ultimately be China's undoing. What has driven the growth of the Chinese economy over the last 20, 30 years has been labor arbitrage. It's been the cheap labor. You can take manufacturing, set it up in China, pay $3 an hour for labor versus $50 an hour in the West. It makes a pretty strong argument to go set up a manufacturing plant in China, and you have virtually unlimited amounts of labor to bring in at those cheap wages. That's what drove the Japanese economy during the 60s and 70s as they exploded. But once that labor arbitrage goes away, as it did in Japan starting in the mid-'80s, you have to have a different dynamic to drive your economy. And China still suffers from the lack of rule of law, from entirely too much central planning and intervention, a lot of corruption. You can't be in business in China without being having someone connected to the military and the government basically as your business partner, all of those things will eventually slow their growth as the labor arbitrage goes away. The issue, though, is they still have hundreds of millions of untapped workers, if you will, that they can bring in from the fields of China and drive very low wages. So it'll drive their growth for some period of time. But the U.S. ultimately, if we maintain what keeps us strong, which is rule of law and a limited government, limited as greatly as we can possibly stand it, those are the keys to long-term growth and prosperity.
Okay, now, knowing that and what we've already discussed here, Frank, where does that leave Russia in all of this discussion?
Well, and that's a great question, Guy, because one of the geopolitical realities that's working against the United States and the West in general at this point is the growing alliance between Russia and China. You might recall that one of several factors during the Cold War that eventually led to the West victory over the USSR was the fact that there was a very subtle uniting of interest between China and the West, particularly the United States. Unfortunately, that has been stood on its head, and right now, China and Russia are in everything but a formally announced military alliance. As we speak at this point in early July, a small Chinese fleet is sailing to the Baltic Ocean where they will engage in joint maneuvers with the Russian Navy. This is a long-standing practice over the past, or not long-standing, but a practice over the past couple of years where Russian and Chinese navies have trained together in the Pacific. In, of all places, the Mediterranean used to be considered an American lake, no longer, and now the Baltic. Increasingly, to Russian weapon sales and some of the most advanced weapons that the Russians have produced are being sold directly to China. So this growing military alliance between Russia and China is going to be one of the key stories of the next several decades.
Okay, Ben, now let's drift down to the Middle East. Iran is still a major player in this. They want the technology from Korea as far as their missiles, and they're probably giving them the missiles, but their nuclear capability. Where does that leave Iran with our fight with ISIS?
Well, look, Iran is gaining power every day in the Middle East. They are winning in Syria. We're defeating ISIS, but the fact is that the Bashar Assad regime, which is in bed with Iran and backed by Iran, along with their new ally Russia, is going to stay in power. That is the reality. The only force that would change that would be a meaningful U.S. military involvement, which I don't think we're going to do, or we don't have a stomach for or an interest in doing. Nor do I frankly think it would be in our strategic interest to do so, given what would follow in Syria. But Iran's in a pretty good position. They're more powerful than they have been in a long time, since the old days of Persian Empire. They are on a path towards gaining nuclear capabilities within the next decade. They are working feverishly to develop long-range ballistic missile capabilities. They have the money to pursue that. They are a wealthy nation, unlike the impoverished North Korea. So North Korea and Iran work hand in glove. Iran can supply funding. North Korea is a great laboratory because it is completely absent from any prying eyes or any interference in the world. So Iranian technicians can go to North Korea and work there in their program. North Koreans can visit Tehran and lecture Iranian engineers and physicists. So they work together very closely. It is a reality. It is a mutually beneficial reality. The problem with Iran going nuclear is that we've talked about it many times. They have an apocalyptic religious regime that runs that country. The Iranians themselves are actually quite Western in outlook, but the mullahs who run Iran are very apocalyptic. They want to bring about the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, and they believe that only circumstances of global chaos will bring that about. So they view it as their religious duty to bring those circumstances around. And what better way than to develop nuclear warheads, put them on missile tips, and nuke Israel and or the United States? They are apocalyptic enough to do it, and damn the torpedoes. They know the Israelis can destroy all of Iran with nuclear weapons. They know the U.S. can do it 1,000 times over. But I think the mullahs there would view that as a small price to pay to bring about a global caliphate, and that is the problem.
I want to get Frank into this, but Ben, while we're still over in that region, across the water is Qatar. How important is that relationship, and what's going on with Qatar right now?
Well, it's a very important relationship. We have a huge air base and military presence there. It's the headquarters of Central Command in the Middle East, so it means a lot to us, and as a result, we will not allow the Gulf states to invade Qatar, but they are putting pressure with U.S. agreement and acquiescence on the Qataris to stop playing their two-faced game where they are enabling a lot of Shia extremism. They've become the banking center that the Iranians use to funnel money to groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and the groups that they support, the terrorist groups that they support in the Middle East. They get money into Syria through Qatar. And that is what this is all about. That is what the U.S. and the Gulf states are trying to get the Qataris to stop doing, to bring an end to. I don't think it'll turn into a military confrontation or an attempted coup. However, we'll see whether they are successful. I think they'll be successful in reducing the Qatari role in money transfers. Whether they'll bring it to an end, time will tell.
All right, Frank, your thoughts.
Well, right now, as we're speaking, the Iranian military is sending its newest warships and missile systems and even commando units into the Caspian Sea for some very advanced training and maneuvers. Just as we said with China, perhaps at a lesser degree, but Iran also is developing into a very powerful military that has no qualms about challenging American naval ships in the region. One of the things we have to look for as being a part of the strategic picture going forward is this intricate relation between Russia, China, and Iran. Indeed, as the former president of George Bush 43 would say, it is indeed an axis of evil. And looking at any of these three powers, Russia, China, and Iran, as a separate entity might not be a good way to plan for the potential threats we're facing, because the real threat comes from the combined activities of all three of them. In land power, in land size, in population, and in contiguity of their landmass, it's the greatest opponent the United States has ever faced.
All right, that brings to an end this segment. We're going to be back. We're going to be talking about the testimony of Susan Rice. Stay with us.
You're listening to Wayman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.